Greetings, class.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Charles, how are you?
I'm well. How about yourself?
I'm well, thank you. Y'all, it's good to see you. Hey, Jacob. Hey, Christian. Hey, Christian.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Oh, good. Thank you.
Great. Hey, Christian, I gave you your grade for your presentation. Did you see that by any chance?
I think. Oh, well, you verbally told me, so
I did, but I put it on Canvas.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I'll
and
check.
Y'all, I wanted to make it say something to you about that real quick. So, what I'm gonna do, actually, let me pull something up. I'm gonna pull up my lecture notebook. I'm gonna do a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. It's good to see everyone. I'm a little concerned that there's not more people here, but I can't control that, and I'm glad to see you three who are here. I want to do some housekeeping things real quick before we get started, and it's good to see everyone. Can you guys see my desktop?
Yes.
Okay. All right, there we go. So here we are. Oh my gosh, that's really weird. That's really weird. Hang on. Give me one sec here. I'm gonna pull it up from Canvas. I know it's correct on Canvas. Here we go. Okay. Oh, I put it in, sorry. I sort of put it a little bit out of order. I kind of screwed up a little bit. Forgive me. We are right here, Wednesday 3/3. I hope y'all can see this. I'm gonna cut and paste this down here. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, y'all. So in terms of the paper grade, what it says on the syllabus is the paper, and please correct me if I contradict myself or say something that you think is wrong. And Mirka, hi, it's nice to see you. So Mirka, I go ahead, I went ahead and put your grade for your presentation on Canvas. Did you see that?
I saw that it was an announcement, but I didn't see the grade.
Okay, cool. It's the grade that I told you, but y'all look with me at Roman numeral 1 here under 3.3.20 housekeeping. I added the presentation grade so that I can give you your grades. I hope that makes sense. And I decided to make the presentation 20% of your grade and the actual paper 80% of the grade. I didn't really think that through totally whenever I created your syllabus and also the paper guide, the guide to the paper that's on Canvas. But does that make sense? What used to be 100 points for your paper is now 80 points for your paper and 20 points for the presentation. Okay, Mirka, does that make sense?
Yes.
Good. Okay, great. That's the first thing I wanted to say. Now let me do another thing. I want to look with you at the reading schedule. At the reading schedule real quick here. So next week is spring break. I hope y'all have a great spring break. You'll notice that right here, David Newsom, who I don't see in class today. Hey, Michael, how are you?
Good.
Good. But I want David to go ahead and present on on the Wednesday after spring break. Okay. A few days ago, I said that because of the snowpocalypse, we will push all due dates back. But that really just applies to your paper, the due date for your paper, and not for the presentations. We can't afford to push the presentations back any. So I would like for David Newsom to plan on going ahead and presenting on the Wednesday after spring break. And so also for Jacob Dunn, who I don't see, and everyone else. Okay. Does that make sense, y'all? And I hope that that's not a shock to you. Am I making sense right now? What do y'all think of what I'm saying right now?
Makes sense.
I want you to
That's
go.
good.
Yeah.
Great. Please stick with the original date for your presentation. We just can't afford to push them back. So, but your paper due date will be pushed back. Okay. Now that's another housekeeping thing. Here is another one. Now, yeah, here's another one. Look with me at Roman numeral 2. Meeting in person. I am looking at the week after spring break. So not the week after spring break, but the week after spring break as a possible time to meet in person. Y'all, because I'm a priest, I look at the numbers of like COVID numbers, hospitalization numbers, blah, blah, blah. The numbers are getting really good. I know that it's a little different for college students because college students probably don't usually have the vaccine, but then maybe you don't need the vaccine as much. I'm not quite sure how to think about that, but the numbers are looking really good. And so what I'd like to do is when we get back from spring break, I'm just going to sort of take stock again. And then if it looks like things are continuing to be good, it may be that the week after spring break, we will meet together in person because honestly, I want to be with you. I want to get to know you in an embodied way. And that would give us a month to do that. Now, okay, now am I making sense so far? Does anyone have any thoughts about that? Comments, questions about that? So Michael, I have something for you. You are one of 3 students who are, I think, in the online section. Are you with me?
Yes.
I'm not totally sure, like if we do move back to camp, if I do move it in person, I'm not totally sure how I'm going to handle you guys yet. And by the way, Jacob Dunn is another, and then there's one other who, Michelle Pfeiffer, I think. Oh wait, I wrote it down here. Yeah, I only have 3 online students, but Michael, like, I don't know.
I'm not entirely opposed to just showing up to campus. I have another class that's I have one course that's an in-person course this semester. So.
Okay, and if it turns out that that's not something that you can do, then I don't know. What I'm thinking about doing is just like having it in class. I'm sitting at a table, my in-person students are right around me, and I'm recording myself on my computer on Zoom.
Yeah, and then I could just watch it later. If even if I couldn't attend it,
yeah.
I guess, let's see here. If I can, it's almost certainly the case that if I can't attend in person, I probably can't attend on Zoom. So I'm thinking I can attend in person.
Okay.
For whatever reason I can't, I'll just watch it on YouTube later.
Great. And I'm going to bounce this off of my boss, Greg Bach, just to make sure that I'm not doing anything wrong. But yeah, anyway, I just wanted to give you a heads up on that. Sure. I would love it if we could spend 4 weeks together. But if we can't, then we'll figure something out. Okay. And then I had one other housekeeping thing to say. Oh yeah, just that when it comes to the discarded image by C.S. Lewis, this is what my copy looks like. I hope that you saw the announcement that I put up after last class. The 3 sections that we're going to be reading are 1, the medieval situation, and then chapter 5, the heavens, and then chapter 7, the earth and her inhabitants. Okay. So yeah, good. We will delve into this. I don't think we're going to get to this today, but we will definitely start it on Monday after spring break, okay? Does anyone have any thoughts or questions at the moment? Just a couple of housekeeping things that I wanted to go through. Today, we will finish Confessions 11 if it kills me, okay? Any questions about any of that, y'all? Okay, we're going to press on with Confessions 11. Very excited about this class. In some ways, this is the stuff that I really, really, really care about from the Confessions, because we're going to be talking about time. So let me pull that up. Here we go. Okay, hope y'all can see that. We're in book 11. And I've got my copy of the Confessions. And we already covered this first bullet point. We covered this second bullet point. We had a great discussion about this section, section 3.5 through 4.6 of book 11. That was great. And so now we're going to move to Augustine's discussion of time. And y'all, what he says about time is that it is a distension of the soul. Now, we're going to come back to that word distension in a moment. You can see a footnote there. But y'all, before we even look at that passage, I want to read that passage and I want to get to it quickly. But before we do that, I just want to remind you, or maybe this isn't reminding you, it's telling you. Hang on. Wow, I'm very disturbed at the moment because I seem to have misplaced my copy of Aristotle's Physics. But in Physics Book 4, Aristotle's Physics Book 4, he defines time, and the Greek word for time is chronos. I'll put that in the chat. He defines chronos as an accident of motion. Chronos, okay? He defines chronos as an accident of motion, and that's in book 4 of Aristotle's Physics. Now, we've done a little bit of ancient philosophy together, but we haven't talked about substance and accident, and we don't have a bunch of time to spend on it. But an accident, a synonym for the word accident is a property. So, for example, my cup, Aristotle would call a substance. We actually have talked about that because all of the things that we can see in the world, Aristotle says are composite unities of form and matter. He also calls those composite unities of form and matter substances. My cup is a substance, and all substances have accidents or properties or qualities. Those are all synonyms. Accidents, qualities, properties. All substances have accidents that inhere in them. So one of the properties / accidents / qualities of this cup is the color brown. Also round. It's round. I would show you that it's round, but I would spill my coffee. So round and brown are properties or accidents of the cup, okay? Aristotle says that basically that time is an accident of motion. And the way I think of that is that he's saying that time is a byproduct of motion. It actually makes a lot of sense. However, Augustine disagrees. Augustine wants to say that Augustine wants to think about time very differently than Aristotle does. And by the way, the Latin word for time is the word tempus. tempus. And let me say this. Let me say this real quick. I would say that for, okay, you know how we've talked about in the class that one of the really interesting things about Augustine is that he is what you might call a first person thinker. We've talked about how the Confessions is a prayer to God addressed in the second person singular, but it's also an autobiography, right? Augustine is saying, I did this, I did that, I felt horrible, I hated my parents, I was a lustful young man, I saw a vision of God's essence. Do you hear that? It's all first person, right? Augustine is very much talking about his own journey and frequently his own psychological state, if you will. That's one of the things that makes him, a lot of people call him the first modern thinker. A lot of people associate him with things like existentialism because Augustine's not a theoretical thinker, right? He's dealing with his own anxieties and his own experiences that he's having in the world. Does that make sense? Well, Aristotle, who we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, but it won't surprise you to hear me say that Aristotle is not like that at all. Aristotle would be what you might think of as a third person thinker. Aristotle isn't talking about himself. In fact, you could read everything that Aristotle wrote 10 times and you won't hear anything about how Aristotle's doing. He does not talk about himself. That's not the point. He is developing a system which describes the world objectively. So Aristotle is an objective thinker. Augustine is more of a subjective thinker. Okay, now does that make sense? So as for all of that, so also for time. When Aristotle describes time, he definitely describes it as being something out there in the world that's objective. But Augustine goes through this routine, this thought experiment in Book 11, by which he concludes that actually time is not something that exists at all objectively. Time is something that really is bound up with the human psyche. Okay, but what I wanted to introduce the whole discussion just by talking about book 4 of Aristotle's Physics, how for Aristotle time is an accident of motion. It's almost like a quality of motion or a byproduct of motion. Does that make sense? But when Aristotle describes time, he does not at all describe time as something that has to do with his own subjective experience, okay? But for Augustine, things are very different. Things are very different. Yeah. Am I making sense so far?
I think so.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So what I want to do next, I want to read this section of book 11, 2633. But before I do that, let me just say, for what Augustine says is that time is a distension of the soul. Now, what in the world is a distension? Look at footnote 7. My definition of distension is it's a combination of distraction and extension. Yeah. And y'all, there's lots and lots of different ways to talk about this. I want to say two things right off the get-go. Number one, let me give you a quick pop quiz and ask you to answer this question, which would be sort of a review question, okay? For pre-modern thinkers, which is better or superior? Stuff that changes or stuff that doesn't change?
Stuff that does not change.
Right. Stuff that does not change is better, right? And so that's relevant here in this discussion as well, in a couple of different ways. First off, last class when we talked about book 7, we talked about over and over again, we talked about the simplicity of God, right? And how there's how over and over and over again, Augustine is drawing out implications of the simplicity of God. And so we've already seen that God is outside of time. Okay, we're going to come back to that today, but I think that we already began to see that in book 7. Okay, let me say it in a different way, or approach it from a different angle, and that would be this. Have you ever had an experience, any kind of experience, where you felt like time stood still? Like, for example, maybe if you've fallen in love, or maybe if you've been captured by a beautiful sunset, or maybe maybe you were reading a book or watching a movie, and you were so engrossed in the experience that you lost all track of time, and it seemed like time no longer existed. And then all of a sudden something happens and you're woken back up, if you will, and now you're suddenly aware of time. Does that make sense? See, I think that those two examples, number one, God's eternity, and number two, that kind of mystical trance-like state, those are two different ways of just wrapping your head around the fact that for Augustine, there's something disturbing about temporality. Temporality, it's not that it's bad, but temporality is closely related to distraction. Is distraction a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, if I held a gun to your head and said, is distraction a good thing or a bad thing, what would you say? You have to pick one. Is it good or bad?
Bad.
Agreed. When you're distracted from something, that's bad. If I'm on a date with my wife and I get distracted by my text messages, that's bad, right? Or if I'm in church and I'm supposed to be listening to a sermon, but I get distracted, that's bad, right? Distraction is bad in general. And so time, there's something about time that's pernicious. It's a distraction, and then it's also an extension. It's almost as if he thinks that that the human experience of time is whenever your soul gets dragged out from you, and your soul becomes strung out, or unraveled, sort of. Okay, now lest I continue to waste your time in BS, why don't we read what he says about it? Okay. This is section 26 of book 11. I'm going to read it. Section 26 of book 11. Okay, and this is on my page 239, actually 240. We'll start on 239 at the very top of that section, 2633. Are y'all there? Do y'all see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to read it. My confession to you is surely truthful when my soul declares that times are measured by me. So my God, I measure and do not know what I am measuring. So all he's doing here is starting to inquire into the nature of time, right? This is very typical Augustine. He does this with all sorts of topics. It's a prayer, but he's beginning to ask questions and to try to figure out what something is. He's doing that with time, okay? For a long So my God, I measure and I do not know what I'm measuring. I measure the motion of a body by time. So that's exactly what Aristotle says in Confessions 4, right? Augustine is saying right there that time is connected to motion. Then am I not measuring time itself? I could not measure the movement of a body, its period of transit, and how long it takes to go from A to B, unless I were measuring the time in which this movement occurs. How then do I measure time itself? Or do we use a shorter time to measure a longer time? That's exactly what Aristotle says in Physics 4, by the way. Do we measure a shorter time? Do we use a shorter time to measure a longer time? As when, for example, we measure a transom by using a cubit length. Not sure what a transom is, but let me ask y'all a question. How many minutes are in an hour? How many minutes are in an hour?
60.
60. And see, right there, we measured a longer time by a shorter time, right? Does that make sense? That's exactly what it's talking about here. So we can be seen to use the length of a short syllable as a measure when we say that a long syllable is twice its length. By this method, we measure poems by the number of lines, lines by the number of feet, feet by the number of syllables. We talked about syllables a little bit last class. And long vowels by short, not by the number of pages, for that would give us a measure of space, not of time. The criterion is the time words occupy in recitation, so that we say that is a long poem, for it consists of many lines. The lines are long, for they consist of many feet. The feet are long, for they extend over many syllables. The syllable is long, for it is double the length of a short one. Nevertheless, even so, we have not reached a reliable measure of time. It may be that a short line, if pronounced slowly, takes longer to read than a longer line taken faster. The same principle applies to a poem or a foot or a syllable. That is why I have come to think that time is simply a what?
Distension.
Distension. And Chadwick has a footnote there, right? Which quotes Plotinus. Let's read that footnote 27. Plotinus speaks of time as a, quote, spreading out diastasis of life. You see that? That's why I say extension. A spreading out of life, the life of the soul in a movement of passage away from one life to another. This text may have influenced Augustine's coining of the term distentio. So that's a term that Augustine coins. But in Augustine, this psychological experience of the spreading out of the soul in successiveness and in diverse directions is a painful and anxious experience, so that he can speak of salvation as deliverance from time. I hope that y'all are seeing a pattern here. If time is somehow stressful for Augustine, if time is bad, what's the opposite of time that is good? What is the opposite of time which is good in Augustine's mind? It's eternity. Eternity, God's eternity. And remember in book 7 of the Confessions, where Augustine barely claims that he had this mystical experience of seeing God. And I hope that y'all remember that. Plotinus was said to have had this mystical experience of seeing God, like, I think it was like 11 times in his life. I can't quite remember. But this is what Augustine was going for. He was wanting to have this mystical experience of seeing God. And in that moment, it's as if time stands still. In that moment, it's as if the human mind is able to somehow attach itself to God's eternity, or to put it a different way, a phrase that Augustine talks about over and over and over again, God's eternal now. God's eternal now. Okay? So this idea of the now is very important for Augustine. And because you see what Augustine says, and I don't think that we're going to read this section where he says this, but what he says is that the future is time, the past is time, but the present now is not time. It has no extension, it has no duration, it's right now. So in a strange way that we might not be accustomed to thinking about, Augustine is really saying that the present moment is not time. The present moment is an absence of time. It's an absence of the future and an absence of the past. It's the present moment, which is most like God's eternity. All right? And why? It's because the present moment is not extended for Augustine, okay? So that footnote 27 on page 240 is pretty important. Augustine speaks of salvation as a deliverance from time. The theme is developed below, especially 11:29-39, where St. Paul's language about being stretched, Philippians 3:13, becomes linked with the thought of Plotinus. What a great example right there of the Christian intermingling of Greek thought and Hebrew thought, right? Because remember, St. Paul is a Jew. St. Paul sat at the feet of Gamaliel. St. Paul was an expert in the law. He was Jewish. And yet here, Chadwick is saying that Augustine's fusing Plotinus and Paul. And that becomes linked with the thought of Plotinus that multiplicity is a falling from the one and is extended in a scattering. Y'all, we've seen the phrase before. Augustine speaks of this world as the realm of dissimilarity, the land of dissimilarity. Do y'all remember that? And I pointed out that that should remind us of Heraclitus. Heraclitus, Heraclitus, for which everything is always changing and there's nothing but a blooming, buzzing confusion. It's as if for Heraclitus, there's only multiplicity. There's only dissimilarity. There's no unity. There's no form. There's no shape. That's kind of how Augustine imagines time. It's an absence of unity. It's being stretched out and pulled thin. Okay? So time for Augustine is a distension of the soul. He literally thinks that it's something that is in our souls. Now, let's keep going. Look with me at Roman numeral 3. Again, time is not external to the mind/soul. So time is not objective. Time is not something that's outside of us that we can look at and measure in an objective scientific way for Augustine. You can measure a long syllable by a short syllable, but that begs the question, what's a short syllable? I mean, you can't find an objective foundation upon which to base any scientific measurement of time because it's inside of us. Let's read 2736. That might be the next one. No, that's on Chadwick 242. Y'all see that? 36. So it is in you, my mind, that I measure periods of time. Do not distract me. See, there we go. My definition of distension is kind of like a cross or a mixture of distraction and distension. Y'all, there's a book that came out about a year ago. Last semester I used it in my intro to philosophy class. It's by a guy named, I'm not going to be able to remember the author's name, but it's called Deep Work. Deep Work. And it's by a computer scientist who teaches at Georgetown University, but he also writes books about work habits and how to be more productive and stuff like that, time management type stuff. And in this book, Deep Work, he talks about the importance of not being distracted, the importance of being focused. What Augustine is talking about here is like being focused but on steroids, okay? And we're going to talk about Plato's line in a moment. A lot of this is directly relevant to Plato's line. But yeah, the opposite of time is being in the moment with your intellect focused on one thing, not a bunch of things, a series of things that takes time to go through, okay? If that reminds you of dianoia on Plato's line, you're right. We'll come back to that. Let me keep reading section 36. So it is in you, my mind, that I measure periods of time. Do not distract me. That is, do not allow yourself to be distracted by the hubbub. I love that. I don't know what the Latin word there is that Chadwick translates as hubbub, but that's an excellent term, hubbub. Do not allow yourself to be distracted by the hubbub of the impressions being made upon you. Y'all, if anyone has ever done yoga or maybe practiced various forms of meditation, and I hasten to remind you or to make sure that you know that meditation is very central to the Christian tradition. It's not just a Buddhist thing. But if anyone has ever practiced meditation or seen a Buddhist monk meditating, think about something like this, or standing in the lotus position in yoga. That would be a great example of what Augustine's talking about, okay? Not being distracted. Okay, are you with me? Do not allow yourself to be distracted by the hubbub of impressions being made upon you. In you, I affirm, I measure periods of time. He's talking to his mind right now. The impression which passing events make upon you abides when they are gone. The present consciousness is what I am measuring, not the stream of past events which have caused it. When I measure periods of time, that is what I am actually measuring. Therefore, either what time is or is not. Therefore, either this is time. Therefore, either this is what time is, or time is not what I am measuring. So, Roman numeral 3, time is not external to the mind or soul, okay? Now, y'all, we have about 20 minutes, and I definitely want to get through what I'm excited because what we're going to talk about in Roman numerals 4 and 5 has to do with the psalm, P-S-A-L-M. But before we get there, I hope that you're thinking about Plato's line. Who can remind me what the 4 moments of Plato's line are?
Images.
Faith, I believe.
Good, Mirka. Pistis would be the Greek word. You could say faith, trust, confidence. Good.
Discursivity.
Discursivity, or the Greek word is dianoia, right. What's the last one?
Wasn't one of them nose? No.
Yes, ma'am. Nous. Let me hear you say nous, Mirka.
Nous.
Good. That means mind or intellect. The Latin term is intellectus, okay? Now, y'all, remember that those first 2 moments, images and pistis, images and faith, they collapse into one moment. And that gives us the ontological assuredness that things are real, right? You have to have both of those 2 things, images and trust, to actually think that this pen is real. So those two collapse into one. And then you have dianoia, putting things together, taking things apart. It's a movement that happens through time, like reading a text or like working on a proof in a geometry textbook. So you've got dianoia that goes through time as a process. And then you have a simplicity on the far side of complexity. Okay, nous is when you grasp the whole. Are you with me? So what I want you to see is that first moment of images plus trust, which I'm going to call that recognition. It's like whenever you like, okay, imagine you're watching a movie and in the movie there's a guy and a girl and they fall in love. They have love at first sight. The moment that they recognize each other, that's images plus pistis. Or if you look up and you see a friend and you recognize him, that's images plus pistis. So you've got recognition, and then you have putting things together and taking them apart. Let me pause right there. In order to put things together, you first have to recognize them. Does that make sense? You can't put things together and take them apart if you don't recognize them first. That's why that first moment is necessary for the next moment, aka for dianoia or discursivity. You have to recognize things before you can put them together and take them apart. So you've got an initial moment of recognition, then you have a process through which you're moving over time, and then you have a simplicity on the far side of complexity where you're like, oh, I get it now, and you grasp the whole, W-H-O-L-E. Are you with me? And that, can you see how that grasping of the whole is, it's a recognition all over again, but on a higher plane. Sometimes fancy philosophers call that first moment apprehension, and then the last moment comprehension. But apprehension and comprehension are related. The difference is that comprehension is on the far side of discursivity. Okay, and y'all, that's Plato's line. I hope you can see that. Now, we're going to move to Roman numerals 4 and 5, where Augustine talks about a psalm. And what you're going to see is that this is exactly what Augustine's talking about. Okay, so look with me at Roman numeral 4 on the outline, and we're gonna read section 2838. Okay, 2838, which is on Chadwick 243. All right. Now, okay, so I don't know if y'all know what the Psalms are. The Psalms in the Old Testament, it's a book of the Bible, but they're also poetry, and they are, you might think of it as Israel's hymn book. These are Psalms that God's people, whether you want to talk about Israel or the church, these are poems or hymns or songs that God's people use to praise God, okay? And they're poems. Now, it's a little confusing that Augustine uses a psalm. Sometimes I wish that he would have used like a biblical story like David and Goliath or something. I find that it's helpful to imagine that he's talking about a story or a narrative, okay? By the way, some of the Psalms are narratives. I can't think of a good example right now, but you know, some of the Psalms rehearse the story of creation. Some of the Psalms rehearse the story of the Exodus. So some of the Psalms are actually stories. I find that it's helpful to imagine that he's talking about a story here. But look with me at section 38, okay? Suppose I am about to recite a psalm which I know. Now notice, he knows the psalm. But what he's really saying is, suppose that I think about a psalm that I already know. It would be like me saying to you, Michael, I want you to think about the first Harry Potter movie. Now, Michael, I assume that you've seen that movie, and I assume that you're fairly familiar with it. And so, when I say think about the first Harry Potter movie, you already have something in your mind. But then, or pretend like it's the first, okay, but then if we sit down and watch it, now you're going through it again. At first you had the whole thing in your mind, but then we go through it again. And then at the end of it, we could have a discussion about it, and you've got the whole thing in your mind again. You've got the whole thing in your mind again, but you've gone through watching it again, so it's better now. All right? Let me read. Suppose I'm about to recite a psalm which I know. Before I begin, my expectation is what? Directed toward the what?
The whole.
The whole. That's just like if I say to Michael, hey, Michael, think about the first Harry Potter movie. He's going to think about the whole thing, not like something that happens 10 minutes after the movie starts. He's going to be thinking about the whole thing. Okay, that's the same here. Before I begin, my expectation is directed towards the whole. But when I have begun, the verses from it, which I take into the past, become the object of my memory. Now, I want you to underline the words, the verses from it, which I take into the past. That's dianoia. He's talking about reading the psalm and moving through the various elements of the psalm, okay? The life of this act of mine is stretched in two ways. In other words, it takes place over time, just like dianoia does. Remember, the meaning of the prefix dia means through. And what I've tried to say to you is that dianoia is a movement of the mind through time. So the verses from it, which I take into the past, become objects of my memory. The life of this act of mine is stretched in two ways. Stretched. Did you hear that? Stretched. Distension is distraction and extension. It's stretched. It's extended in two ways. Into my memory, because of the words I've already said, and into what? Expectation. See, for Augustine, the opposite of memory is expectation, okay? Memory is about the past. Expectation is about the future, okay? Because of those which I'm about to say, but my attention is on what is present. See, my attention is on what is in the present. By that, the future is transferred to become the past. As the action advances further and further, the shorter the expectation and the longer the memory, right? As he's reading through the psalm, what happens is that more and more of it goes into the past, and littler and littler of it remains in the future, right? What occurs in the psalm as a whole occurs in its particular pieces and its individual syllables. All he's doing is breaking down the whole thing into parts. Just like we could talk about verse 3 of the psalm, or we could talk about this particular scene of the Harry Potter movie. Anything that you can do as a whole, you can also do on parts. In other words, every part is a smaller whole. Are you with me? Every part is a smaller whole, W-H-O-L-E. The same is true of a longer action in which perhaps this psalm is a part. In other words, Everything that Augustine says about a psalm can be said both for parts of the psalms, but also for larger wholes of which the psalm is a part. Does that make sense? He's just talking about parts and wholes, okay? It is also valid of the entire life. I think this next line is amazing. It is also valid of the entire life of an individual person, where all actions are parts of a whole, and the total history of the sons of men, where all human lives are but parts. Now, y'all, I want to make 2 points real quick before we go to Roman numeral 5. First off, imagine that you go to a funeral. Imagine that your grandpa has died. You go to the funeral and your uncle stands up and he gives a eulogy of your grandpa, okay? And what's going on in that moment is that you're seeing your grandpa's entire life as a whole, W-H-O-L-E. Augustine's saying that this grasp of the whole can apply to a psalm. It can apply to a part of a psalm. It can apply to a larger unit of which the psalm is just a part, like, for example, the entire Psalter, or maybe one of the 5 books of the Psalms. It can also apply this action of grasping the whole. It can apply to an entire human life, like the life of your grandpa at the funeral. When you're not thinking about your grandpa when he was 41, you're thinking about his whole life altogether. But last, it can apply to the entire narrative of the human race. All right. Now pause real quick. Who can remind me of what part 1 of the Confessions is about? Part 1 of the Confessions is what?
It's his autobiography type thing.
That's right. It's the story of Augustine's life. And what is part 2 about, Jacob Dunn? Not the story of Augustine, but the story of what?
Story of the world, right?
Right. The world, which is really closely related to the human race. Are you with me? So maybe, and does Augustine talk about the human race right here? The total history of the sons of men, where all human lives are but parts. That's the last 2 lines of this section. He's talking about the whole human race. Are you with me? Maybe this is why he's talking about time. He's got to talk about time if he's going to talk about the whole human race. This is crazy stuff, but it's brilliant. Yeah. So y'all, that's what I mean by Augustine's phenomenology of time as exemplified by a psalm. I don't really have time to talk about what I mean by the word phenomenology. Yes, I do. All I mean by phenomenology is the way we experience time. And I could talk a lot more about that. Augustine is paying very close attention to his experience of time, and he notices that his experience of time involves a transition from expectation to memory. Expectation to memory. As the future slides into the past. But he also thinks that it goes through him, and that as that happens, he's being distracted away from the present. And the present is where the good stuff is for Augustine, the present moment. I'm not trying to say that Augustine hates discursive reason, but like many, like all of my favorite philosophers and theologians, he does think that discursive reason is not the be all and end all. He thinks that discursive reason, the whole point of it is to lead to nous. He's a good Platonist. The whole point of dianoia is to lead to the simplicity on the far side of complexity. It's to lead to some kind of epiphany where you grasp the whole and you're united to something bigger than you, ultimately God. And this is what Christians mean by the beatific vision. Okay? Now, okay, let's do one more thing before we stop. And I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to talk about it. And I'll bet I can do this in like 5 minutes or less. I'm on Roman numeral 5. But y'all, maybe I should stop and just see, does anyone have any questions? We're actually doing okay on time. Remember, we're going to delve into C.S. Lewis on Monday after spring break. But does anyone have any questions, comments? I know that this is weird and it's also a lot. Yes, Jacob.
Yes, it is a lot. But you said Augustine thinks that time is just internal to us. It's not real. Would he say it's not real?
I'm not sure. No, he would. Let me tell you why he would not say that it's not real. Because that would be like saying that the soul is not real. As a good Platonist, Augustine thinks that that which is in us is more real than the external world. That is why Augustine isn't just some sort of postmodern constructivist who says that things like gender are social constructs. Okay? Just because time is subjective, and that even that word subjective has a real downside to it because it's a modern category. But just because something's subjective or in the soul for Augustine does not mean that it's not real. If anything, it probably means that it's more real. Because as a good Platonist, soul and mind are not less real than the external world, but more real.
Does that make them better?
Better? Does that make what better than what?
If the soul and mind are more real than the external things, and that means they are better than
it does. It does mean that. And if we had more time, or if you were to take my intro class, I think that in my intro class, I introduced two terms, the terms noble and base. These ancient thinkers like Aristotle, they tend to be hierarchical and they tend to rank things. And so, for example, Aristotle ranks the different forms of good or the good. He says that beauty is the most noble form of the good. And then after that, you've got pleasure, which is not as noble as beauty, but it's still pretty good. And then you've got base, or the lowest grade of the good, which he says is utility. Utility is not bad in Aristotle's mind. It's just the lowest form of the good. It's base. So yes, Jacob, I think that Augustine would say that the soul is more noble than the things of the external world. I think that he would say that.
But he's not calling material bad.
He's not
saying the soul is better. Okay.
That's right.
And did I hear you say
more
that?
Noble.
Okay. Does Augustine think the present is eternal since it's not in time?
I think that he probably does think that.
Okay.
What does that mean? I'm not sure, but I think that he would say that, yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I'm kind of trying to, this is kind of, well, okay, one thing that it sounds like is that, experience of time is not an absolute, and it's also there's our experience of time varies, and sometimes it's difficult to know why that why our experience of time varies. One thing that makes time seem objective is that there's a lot of, despite us having moments where time goes by faster or slower, it seems like generally people have a lot of agreement or similar experiences of time. For example, we can, we all have some sort of a rough standard of an idea of what an hour feels like, or, maybe even more concretely, we can meet, here today at 2:30 roughly, to talk about things. Or maybe another example would be, the sun, for example. So one way I'm trying to think about reconciling all these ideas is something like we all have our own individual subjective experience of time, and that's really all it is ultimately. But because we all have souls that are the same, our subjective experiences resemble each other. So they don't vary so widely that my experience is just, arbitrary, or let's see here, or everyone's experience is subjective, but the differences don't vary to the degree where it's arbitrary. Let's see here. So
I like that.
yeah. So, and I think you could kind of talk about maybe perhaps, appreciate like art along these sorts of lines, which I think ties in with beauty. But let's see here. So I don't know. It's kind of like trying to grab a fish.
Yeah. Well, I think what you said is great.
When you got soap on your hands and you're jumping on a trampoline, it's kind of hard to grab it, But
let me say another thing, and then I want to move on to Roman numeral 5, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The other thing is maybe there's different kinds of time. So Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas both think that there's different kinds of time. And you know who doesn't seem to think that? Aristotle. But like Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas talk about the time of the angels.
Okay, so maybe on a different plane or something, like they're because by virtue of being angels, being immortal, not having a physical manifestation, or at least not, they have more of an understanding of what it's like to not have a physical manifestation. It makes sense that their experience of time would be different. Is that what that means?
I think so. Okay, y'all, I'm going to go to Roman numeral 5. Jacob Dunn, it's nice to see you. Roman numeral 5. Okay, I'm going to try to keep this really short, and I'm not going to read it. So check it out. So what we just said is that when Michael Graham thinks about the Harry Potter movie, both before we watch it and after we watch it, he's seeing the whole. Are you with me? He's grasping the whole. He's thinking about the whole. He's focusing on the whole. He's intending the whole. Are you with me so far? Now, that is how God thinks. In other words, what God doesn't do is dianoia. God always grasps the whole. So all of human history and all of creation from the Big Bang 13 billion years ago, is that the current number? 13 point something billion years ago, I think. From the Big Bang up until however long the universe is going to last, God sees the whole. And that goes along with God's simplicity, right? Because God is not subject to temporal duration or change. God is outside of time. And it makes sense because Augustine thinks that time is created. Now, there's a lot more I could say about this. I'm giving you the simple version, which is fine. But I hope that Roman numeral 5 makes sense. God's way of knowing is analogous to Augustine's knowing a psalm. What that means is that in the same way that Augustine sees the whole before he reads the psalm and then after he reads the psalm, even though the second grasping of the whole is better than the first one because it's gone through the reading, right? Nevertheless, God's knowing is like that. He sees the whole always. And if you think about it, you can begin to see a link up there with the present and with eternity. See, whenever you see the whole, that is not a temporal, for Augustine, that is not a temporal sequence. It involves no temporal duration. When you recognize something or behold something, that's not a temporal event for Augustine. You might say that it's an eternal event, or you might say that it's it is an event in the present now, NOW. That's what the Buddhist monk is striving for when he meditates, to be in the moment, to grasp the whole, to not be spread out and distracted and extended. All right, so y'all, we got to go. Yay, we did it. We have read Augustine. I've taken a group of undergrads through the Confessions. That was fun. And we're a little behind, but it's okay. Read C.S. Lewis, The Discarded Image, chapters 1, 5, and 7, the medieval situation, the heavens, and the earth and her inhabitants. Okay, we're about to shift gears, but does anyone have any questions, comments about the Confessions? We can talk for 3 more minutes if we want to. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
It's not about the Confessions, but the discarded image readings, the chapter names at least are in the announcement, right?
I don't remember if I put the names or not. I definitely put an announcement up. Yes.
Okay. They are in the announcement.
Great. Any other thoughts, questions? What do y'all think of Augustine? I would love for everyone to give me one. Okay, I want 3 of y'all to give me something you like about Augustine and something that you don't like about Augustine. Go.
I like that it makes me think, but I also get confused by him sometimes.
I would elaborate on that and say it's both relatable and very difficult to understand at the same time.
That's a good way to put it.
I like that. I like that you could understand it a little, like you could kind of relate with it, kind of like what they were saying. You kind of knew the direction that he was trying to go, but I didn't like how he started repeating himself, trying to change it. That's where I started getting lost.
Okay. Well, keep in mind we only read 3 books. Book 1, which was sort of an intro, just to whet our appetite, to learn sort of the way he talks, and also to wrap our minds around the fact that it's a prayer. And then we read book 7, which is when he discovers the books of the Platonists, which rescue him from Manichaeism, this error of imagining that God is spatially extended, and also of imagining that God has some sort of rival, some sort of being that is equally ultimate to God. Notice, he did not repent of those errors because of the Bible. No, he repented of those errors. He came to his senses because of Plato/Plotinus. That's very interesting. He thinks that set him up to believe the gospel, to believe the Catholic faith. But he was converted to Plato and Platonism in that experience, okay? And then book 11 is really about time. Okay? Y'all, it's been real, and I hope you have a great spring break. And if you have any questions, as always, let me know, okay?
We've got one quick question after everyone leaves, if that's okay.
Are you sure you don't want to ask it now, Jacob?
Yes, sir. It's a bit more personal.
Okay. Okay. Jacob, why don't you give me a call then?
Okay, that'll work.
Okay. Y'all have a great spring break. I will see you in a week or a little more than a week. Bye-bye. Take care.
All right.